Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Valérie Gauthier as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, let me introduce our today's guest. Dr. Valérie Gauthier is an associate professor of languages and cultures at HEC Paris, where she integrates cross-cultural insights with leadership and communication studies. She educated in France and the United States and holds degrees across disciplines, earning a BS in psychology from the University of Paris, two master's degree in modern literature and English, a PhD in comparative literature from the Sorbonne University, and later completed Stanford Graduate School's executive program. Her career reflects a lifelong commitment to shaping the future of leadership education. As the Dean of the HEC Paris MBA from 2002 to 2010, she trained over 200 MBA participants annually and spearheaded a transformative redesign of the program's curriculum. Under her stewardship, HEC Paris moved from 67th to 18th place in the Financial Times Global MBA ranking, cementing its place among the world's leading business schools. Since 2011, Professor Valérie has served as a visiting professor at NYU Stern and MIT Sloan, teaching relational leadership and business communication, a pioneering approach she conceived to build trust, purpose, and creativity within organizations. Her concept of Savoir-Relier has influenced thousands of leaders and institutions across the globe, fostering collaboration and mindful innovation. To expand its reach, she launched within Savoir-Relier.com in 2019, a digital platform designed to bring sustainable relational leadership practices to individuals and enterprises worldwide. Her leadership impact extends beyond academia. As the holder of the HEC Pano Ricard Leadership Chair, she created and directed the widely acclaimed Leadership Certificate Program at HEC Paris. A celebrated educator, Dr. Valérie has named Best HEC Professor of the Year and received the Verniman Award in 2001. She was also honored in 2010 as a Knight of the National Order of the Legion of Honor and recognized the same year by Fortune magazine's Global Visionaries Forum. Beyond her intellectual and professional achievements, Dr. Valérie has excelled in sports and the arts, winning the French Sky Open Master 2 gold medal in 2004 and ranking 4th in the US National Association of Intercollegiate Athletes Tennis Championship in 1983. Her passions for poetry, painting, education, and technology continues to reflect her deep belief in human connection and creative growth. In today's episode, Dr. Valérie Gauthier shares key insights from her prominent book, Leading with Sense, The Intuitive Power of Savoir-Relier. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Valérie Gauthier to the conversation. Professor Valérie, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Professor, in a world of constant disruption and uncertainty, how does Savoir-Relier define what it means to be a successful leader compared to more traditional authority-driven model of leadership?
The key for me in leadership is to base your leadership on relationships. That's why among all the models of leadership, from transactional, transformational, situational, distributed, all of the models of leadership, I chose to focus on relational leadership because for me, without relationships, there is no leadership. And my whole background and not only education but practice has shown that human relationships, because human beings are social beings, they need to be with each other. What makes a company or a leadership successful is your ability to build trust and to build an environment where people feel safe enough to engage their own trust in each other, to achieve common goals, and to make a company, be it an entrepreneurship experience or a large organization, thrive through the set of relationships that are conducive to performance and happiness at the same time.
Professor, you argue that we must move away from top-down leadership toward a more open, relational form of leadership based on trust and sense. What inner shift does a leader need to make to genuinely move away from control to connection?
What is very important in developing this type of leadership, this relational leadership, is to have certain characteristics. The word characteristic is important because when people connect, they tend to compare and to even judge one another, to say good, bad, strength, weakness. And when I speak of characteristics, I mean respecting the person for who he is or she is, which is independent from the good and the bad. And for me, the three characteristics that make an effective leader are what I call genuine, generous, and generative. So the three G's bear the essence of effective leadership and of successful organizations because they carry the needs to combine your ability to be yourself in your relationships, so to be authentic and transparent. So that's the genuine part, but also to be generous, that is to be listening to others and to integrate what people have in their mind, but also in their emotions, but also in their expertise. So the wholeness of the person for who he is or she is, and respecting that person, even when you have disagreements, dissensions, and ways of seeing the world that are different. So that requires a form of generosity, which is committing to the listening part of the other and integrating that part into the way you interact with one another. And finally, generative, because to achieve something, you have to want to produce value. And that generative part is this will to produce, to create value, to create sense. So leading with sense, to build a common purpose, a common sense. So that purposeful leadership and impactful leadership requires that generative dimension that has a resonance with this ability to accept that you can make mistakes and to recognize your own mistakes and to grow from them. And when you want to create or innovate, to innovate with purpose, not just for the sake of innovation, but to build something that builds sense for the world.
Professor, many executives hesitate to talk about gut feeling in decision making. How do you encourage leaders to legitimate and cultivate intuition alongside analytical thinking? And can you share a moment when intuition clearly changed the outcome of a decision?
It's a very important part for me of leadership, and what is very, very essential in understanding the role of intuition in decision making is not to dissociate emotional state or intuition with the rational mind, but to associate the two. In other words, to be able to have an intuition and acknowledge this intuition, but also to confront this intuition with facts when you have time to do that. And one instance a story that I often share to talk about intuition, that is actually a real life story, something that I have experienced in my life that made me reflect a lot on the notion of intuition, is a story of when I was young. I was about 15 years old, and I used to ski, as you said in my introduction. That is way too broad for actually who I am, but I was indeed a skier at some point in my life. And I was going on a ski expedition with a senior guide and friends. We were five. And going up the slopes, we were climbing, and the senior guide was taking us in ideal conditions. So the weather conditions were good, the snow conditions were good, and we were heading for a great day of ski. But at some point, after about 2 hours of climbing, our guide told us to move out, to very, very strongly pushed us to step aside from our tracks. And so we did, because we trusted him. So we followed what he said, and we pushed on the side. And very soon, a few seconds later, we had an avalanche, a huge avalanche that fell. And thank God did not take us, but actually blew us. And we were really scared, but we were saved. And I'm telling this story because if our guide had been really rational in the situation, he would have thought about the weather conditions, the snow conditions, and the fact that we shouldn't be facing an avalanche at this stage in the situation we were in, and yet it happened. So what really saved us was very likely his experience. And in his experience, there are two things. There's what he knew, but also what he felt. And what he felt was probably vibrations. You know, when you have a situation like this in the mountains, you have a kind of vibrations and also a sound that you may hear that we, being not so experienced as he was, did not hear, but of course that he captured because he was very vigilant. And his intuition was actually the fruit of long years of experience and living similar conditions that made him take that decision instantly and actually saving our lives. And the point I'm making when I share this story is that decision making is not just rational, but it's also built on experience. If you're capable of building from that experience a knowledge and an understanding of situations that go and for which the medium is the intuition. And if you're able to listen to this intuition, to listen to your sensations, to your emotions, to what you feel and not just what you think, you're likely to make better decisions. And actually, lots of research, and including my research, has proven along the years of research that decisions are made with emotions and not without emotions. So you have to control them, you have to know them, but it's your experience that allows you to grow. So it's a long story, but it's, I think, an interesting one to address the question of intuition versus rational thinking, which for me need to be associated and not opposed.
Professor, in Leading with Sense, you invite leaders to become poets and translators in a business world. What does it practically mean for a manager or CEO to act as a poet and translator in daily leadership? And how does this change the way they handle conflict or complexity?
That's a tough question, and it's a question that goes back to my PhD dissertation, which was indeed on poetic translation back in the days in 1992, where I actually developed a theory and I put it in practice. So it's always been very important for me to associate the same way you associate intuition and rational thinking. You need to associate theory and practice, not just theory for theory's sake, but theory put in practice that allows you to question your own ideas and to test them with the reality. So for poetry and translating poetry, what I discovered was that poetry is not just, beauty. It's actually language in complexity, because in poetry you have words, but they don't just mean. The words have meaning, but they also sound. There's resonance in poetry. They build images. You have metaphors and you have lots of poetic devices that allow you to go beyond the meaning of words and create an atmosphere. They create emotions. So it's language with its whole complexity. So if you want to translate poetry, you cannot do word for word. You have to understand the whole ecosystem in which the words coexist and function and are associated with one another. And if you want to translate, you have to understand the completeness of the poem, of the poet, and the culture of the poet, and the language. So if you want to translate, let's say, a poem from English to French, which is what I did with the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop, and it's the example that I take, you have to understand the American culture, the American language, the way the words are associated with one another, what they produce together, the sounds, the images, and so on, so that you can transfer that understanding into a new, what I call, language space. And to do that, as a translator of poetry, you have to make decisions. And you have to make choices because, again, you cannot translate word for word. So you have to decide, here, I'm going to put forward the sound of the C, the SS sound that is repeated. There, I'm going to privilege the image of the water because water is key in these poems. And I make those choices as a translator. Another translator of poetry might make different choices. The result and what matters is that the end reader in the new language needs to perceive the similar emotions and understand the meaning at the same time. That's why it's both intuition and rational thinking. And that's where it's so complex. So I associate the role of the translator of poetry to the role of a leader, because a leader has to make decisions that are complex with situations and problems and data that is very, very complex, but still has to pick and choose elements that are resonant, that make sense for him or her, to build sense in a new environment. So it's from sense making to sense building. And this passage from one to the other makes an effective leader or not effective leader. To respect the original mindset, the original structure, and the original sense of what's being said and transmitted in the first place into a new environment, a new language, a new space, so that the people will understand and feel, both understand and feel what is at stake in this environment. And that's what I feel is really interesting in today's world, because we are in a world that is more and more complex with more and more tensions. And if you want to make sense of that world, you have to really decode and understand and analyze what's going on, and also make that effort to project what you have in your hands into something in the future that is uncertain. And we know how uncertain the world is today. And in that uncertainty, trust that you're going to build something that will create sense for other people. So you have to have this sense of projection and willingness to develop something that will create a better environment for the people around you.
Professor suggests that tensions and paradoxes are not problems to eliminate, but resources to work from. How can leaders practically use tension between control and freedom, stability and innovation as a catalyst for trustworthy, sustainable relationships and better decisions?
That's also a very good and a very difficult, probably the most difficult thing to do as a leader, is to constantly find the best balance between this need for structure. And when I speak about this in my work, I usually refer to probably one of the most difficult jobs in the world, which is being a parent. And as a parent, when you educate your children, and you can remember if you're not a parent when you were a child, you need a certain element of structure to see where you're going, what you can do, what you can't do. So the frame that gives you the where you cross the line and where you are in the frame. And inside that structure, to have enough freedom to express yourself, to be yourself, to be authentic, to have initiative, innovation. And it's very difficult, and particularly in today's world, with the difference in the environment we're in, the digital world, the new generations that come with a new sense of the world and a new way of interacting with each other, or using AI and the environment they're in. Those shifts make it even more difficult to set the limit between the amount of structure you need and the amount of freedom that you need. And for me, working on that balance constantly, testing the balance, but always being wary and careful about leaving enough space for people to breathe. Otherwise, they suffocate and they cannot grow. But growth being a critical element of development for leadership, you have to strike that balance constantly. And sometimes you have to be strong and firm and say no. And this is my decision, and it's not going to move. And you control and you supervise and so on. And sometimes you let go and you create that space for expression, self-expression, and development, where you have to actually take a step back and either delegate or again let go and give that space for others so they can be themselves. And it's in that contradiction and tension that you have between structure and freedom that you have to adjust and adapt. So it's also part of adaptive leadership, and take into account your surrounding and make the effort of doing something that is probably a skill that everyone should grow and develop into, which is to what is called coming down your ladder. And I'm referring to Chris Argyris, the ladder of inference, where most of us, without knowing it, are on top of our ladder with our beliefs, our knowledge, what we think we know, and that takes us in a sphere that is ours. But coming down our ladder means having the courage of accepting that other people have different ways of looking at life and problems and situations, and making the effort to come down and accept this other perspective and point of view is sometimes called empathy. For me, is more really this effort, a significant effort and work on opening up, questioning, and also explaining without defending yourself, but just proposing other options, but taking the space and the time to for people to express themselves and interact with you. And that's where I think the world is suffering very much, because being on top of your ladder means being in your cognitive biases and not even trying to see the world as other people see it, from their own culture, their own education, their own background, their own religion, and just blindfolded, seeing the world with the blindfold and not even looking at other ways of looking at it.
Professor Savoir-Relier emphasizing valuing difference, working across boundaries, and valuing complex systems. What does relational intelligence look like in a multicultural team? And what are the some traps leaders should avoid when they try to connect across cultures?
And you're touching here on what was the heart of the development of Savoir-Relier for me, which was in becoming the dean of the full-time MBA at HEC and having participants from 40 to 50 nationalities, actually many of them from India. And we had some years up to 20% Indians in the class, and that was a great experience. Side note, but I always felt that being the dean of the MBA was for me an opportunity to see the world in one place, which is in Jouy-en-Josas near Paris. And this multicultural environment made me really reflect on what different cultures meant, because it's not just a question of national culture, it's also a question of personal culture. And maybe you lived in India for 20 years or 30 years, and then you moved to the US, and then you moved to Europe, and then you were here and there. But it's true that it's not just your national culture or where you were born that affects who you are. It's all that you have experienced in your life, education, experience in companies, and working in this or that field, that make you who you are as an individual. So the notion of culture and working across cultures was first for me the main challenge in the MBA. But soon I discovered that beyond cultures, you had persons, individuals, and it was that you need to work on, that you needed to work on, which was to really discover the person for who he is or she is, and not think, oh, he's German, therefore he is that way or that way, or he or she is French, therefore she is this way or that way, because the French culture means this and this and that. And the stigmats that you have, or the way you stigmatize people based on their culture, is sometimes very misleading. And the extra effort you need to make is to really discover what behind the culture is part of the person, and what is the person herself or himself, based on what he or she has been through in his life, or in his travels, in his different company experience, different style of education, and that has made that person evolve. And I think for me, the main consequence of this working across cultures is to work again, working with Ed Shine and the pyramid of the symptoms and what is the underlying assumptions of what you think people are, to work across those differences, to make this effort to discover exactly who the person is for who he is or she is, and not what you think he or she represents.
Professor, the book offers methods and tools to train this new way of leading. If you had to choose just one or two simple practices that our listeners could start tomorrow to strengthen their Savoir-Relier muscle at the individual, interpersonal, or organizational level, what would they be?
I I think if I had answered that question just 2 years ago, I would have answered differently, because the Savoir-Relier methodology is a structured method that has 4 steps with tools that are defined and are working really well. One is the solo, where you work on yourself, and it's absolutely essential. If you do not question yourself and accept to look at yourself in the face, reflecting on yourself, doing introspection, writing about it, and sharing that in a duo, nothing happens. But more recently, I have developed a new angle that allows for people to step in the methodology and the tools, which is called dialogue. And dialogue is a tool for me that really breaks the rule of how difficult it can be to engage in a self-development and interpersonal development. And with dialogue, you encompass everything, because you have both the importance of opening up by telling a true story to someone, a 1-minute story, which is part of the game dialogue, but also to listen to that story and try to guess what emotion is hidden behind the story. So to look at the rationale of the story, the elements that are facts and elements that describe the story, but also what the person has felt. And in trying to dig and figure out what the emotion is, to engage in an exchange with other people who have different understanding of the story and different guess, intuition about what the emotion is, yet to try and agree on one emotion only, because in the game you have to guess one emotion, because there's only one that has been drawn randomly and that you have to guess. And that effort that you need to make to agree is this interpersonal trust builder that allows you to listen to each other, to take into account the different arguments, and to build something that may be different from what your idea was, or anybody else's idea, as a matter of fact. And then sometimes the right answer is outside everyone's intuition or idea, because it's been built through dialogue, through this capacity to listen to each other and integrate the point of view, perception, analysis of everyone to decide together, this is what we think is the right answer. And this effort in dialogue is, for me, the best process, and it is a process, which, by the way, very importantly, one of the reasons why I particularly value relational leadership is that one of the 5 pillars of relational leadership is that it is process-oriented. In other words, when you want to develop yourself as a leader, you have to have method, you have to have structure. And again, you need freedom, but you need to have that frame of reference. And when I speak about structure, I usually refer to rules. And what's great about a game is that you have rules. Actually, I have the game dialogue with me here, and it's a board game, so I can show it to you. Dialogue is a board game that it's a box that, a game you play. So you have it here, and you can practice it. So you have these rules of the game and this board that is physical. And then inside those rules, you will learn and make progress, because you will exercise behaviors and you will grow a better person by practicing and by working with it.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. You say that leading with sense help us write our own stories with acumen, humility, and respect. For leaders who feel stuck in inherited narratives about success, hierarchy, or power, how can Savoir-Relier help them rewrite their story and design a more human, resilient organization?
One keyword in what you said is a critical one in talking about leadership. And if you want to write your own story, and I think today one of the big issues with leadership is the notion of power. If you associate leadership with power and power only, it's likely to be very autocratic and very focused on the individual. And in my understanding of what leadership is becoming, that is the main hurdle we have to face, is to not exclude power, because power is part of the game. And let's face it, when you are in a leadership position as a status, you exercise a form of power. But the question is not exercising power, is abusing power. And I always say that for the story of leadership to unfold, what is very important is not to think in terms of status, but to think in terms of action. And I'm going back to this essential notion that leadership is not leadership if it's not enacted in the way you perform it, and you're actually evaluated on your leadership based on the acts that you take. And those acts are representative of good or bad leadership, so you can actually assess good and bad leadership. But you and yourself, and you being aligned with your purpose and your sense of purpose, is the most critical element of your story, because in the long run, if you keep lying to yourself, if you're just in the showing off and the being, rather than in being yourself and thinking about the generous, also about the others, and not just yourself, and not selling an image or status or power, but also playing a role of influence that engages others, where people can find themselves in it and feel they are a part of that project. This is where you're going to actually make a difference in the world, and not by, even if yes, we have examples today of power that is enforced and forcing itself through the world. For me, this type of power is not sustainable. And if you want to see the world not just optimistic in a naive way, but optimistic in a constructive way, you need to make that effort of onboarding people with you and creating this alignment between your values, personal, professional, and what you do with them. So I think it's very important to take into account this genuine, generous, and generative that will allow you to grow as a person, as a leader, and having others around you, not just because you have the power, but because you are a human being that wants to embark others and help others.
Thank you, Professor Valérie Gauthier, for sharing your fascinating and thoughtful insights on Savoir-Relier and relational leadership. Your work reminds us that leading with intuition, trust, and human connection is not only possible but essential in today's world. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me in Business Talk. Thank you, Deepak.